What does it mean to be born royal, but never allowed to exist? They found a blood-stained cloth beneath the east wing of an old Tudor palace, torn at the edges, wrapped around nothing, just cloth and blood. It was hidden in the corner of a stone cellar where the rats no longer ran, where even the guards whispered before descending. Some believed it was part of a curtain. Some claimed it belonged to a child, but there was no record of a child ever sleeping in that part of the palace. No baptism, no name, no mother officially noted, just silence. The records of that week were missing. The maids were changed, and one old nurse, found years later in a convent near York, would only say this: there was a cry once, then nothing, and then we never spoke of it again. How does a king erase a child? How does he bury not only the body, but the memory, not with poison, not with steel, but with quiet, with policy, with laws that deny breath to those who should have inherited it? This is not a story of rebellion, nor of conquest. It is about what a throne demands when it fears its own reflection, when the blood that built it begins to bleed from too many directions, when even an infant, innocent and wordless, becomes a threat. He ruled as father of a nation, but inside the stone walls, behind velvet drapes and divine proclamations, he made decisions that turned cradles into coffins, lullabies into secrets, and suns into shadows. The historians recorded victories. The clergy sanctified the reign. But beneath it all, the floorboards of that old palace still creak with truths that were never supposed to be heard. Not all legacies are built from statues. Some are carved from the bones of those never named. He was born not just to rule, but to secure a legacy that no one could question. A second son by accident, a king by fortune, a man who watched his brother die so that a crown could fall into his lap. But what he inherited was not peace. It was a kingdom haunted by instability, hungry for continuity, and obsessed with the legitimacy of blood. From the moment he wore the crown, he became more than a man. He became a vessel. His body was no longer his. It belonged to the throne, to the church, to the whispers of dynasties that demanded a pure, unbroken line. His failures would not be personal. They would be national tragedies. His desires were to be law. His children were to be weapons or warnings. He married. He remarried. He tore down a church to claim a womb. But the heirs he longed for came slowly, and some not at all. And in the spaces between royal pregnancies, in the shadowy margins of court life, others were born. They came from rooms no noble would visit, from the arms of ladies who never dared look up, from silences between banquets. They were the wrong children, born of the wrong women, at the wrong time. And yet, they carried the same blood, the same color of eyes, the same shape of hands. Some of them were acknowledged for a time, given small titles, quiet rooms, tutors who never asked questions. There was a boy once, said to resemble the king more than any of the legitimate heirs. He was seen at tournaments, watching with unnatural stillness. Then he was no longer seen. Others were whispered about. A girl with hair too red to be dismissed as coincidence. A sickly child hidden in the estate of a distant cousin. A page boy in the chapel who was always alone. They were not peasants, not accidents in taverns or in battlefields. They were born within reach of the crown, but never allowed to touch it. And that made them dangerous, because in a kingdom built on the sanctity of blood, Even one drop outside the lines could unmake the entire picture. They were reminders of mistakes, of passions, of secrets never meant to become flesh. And so, their names were softened, erased, or never written at all. Yet they lived, for a time. Some were sent away under the veil of education. Others joined religious orders far too young. A few simply disappeared, their rooms emptied, their beds stripped, the maids replaced, their mothers silenced. One servant once spoke of a child who refused to sleep under sheets. He said the boy told him, "Blankets are for those who are meant to wake up." That boy's name was never recorded, and yet the throne knew he existed. There was never a proclamation of their birth, no formal documents, no parades, no christenings in gold-threaded gowns. And yet, these children bore the same blood as those who were carried through the halls of Westminster in jeweled cradles. One chamberlain, long retired and half-blind, once confessed in a letter never sent that he had delivered a tray of sweetmeats to a hidden wing of the palace. The tray was meant for a girl of 11. She had pale fingers and a voice trained in Latin. She bowed to no one. And the next month, the wing was sealed. The tray was never returned. To be born of royal blood was a privilege, but to be born of royal blood without sanction was a curse. The king's obsession with legitimacy was not merely personal. It was political. Every bastard was a crack in the illusion, a threat to the sacred order he claimed to embody. If one child, born outside marriage, could claim descent, what stopped another, or a dozen, or 100? And so, walls were raised, not of stone, but of forgetting. The most brutal executions leave bodies. The most effective erasures leave nothing. There were women who carried his children and were later wed to foreign nobles, their bellies already swollen. There were servants who died suddenly after speaking too freely. And there were books in the royal library with pages missing, not torn, but cleanly removed, as if the very idea of certain births was too dangerous to survive ink. One advisor, cautious and devout, once warned the king that God sees all children as innocent. The king did not answer. He only burned the letter. By the time his reign entered its second decade, the palace had become a machine of concealment. It knew how to hide footsteps in empty corridors. It knew how to remove names from ledgers. And it knew how to train even a mother to deny the cry of her own child. These were not mere byproducts of lust. They were the silent offspring of a sovereign's ambition, the shadowed results of power trying to purify itself. And what happens when blood tries to erase its own echo? That question would define the darkest chapter of a dynasty already soaked in red. In the third decade of his reign, he was no longer merely king. He was institution. His image adorned coins, tapestries, altarpieces. His word shaped law and bent heaven. He had broken with Rome, reshaped the church, annulled queens, and executed confidants. The throne did not just command loyalty, it demanded reverence. But power, once seized, does not rest, it begins to rot. Henry VIII had become a sovereign shaped by fear as much as ambition. Fear that his line would end. Fear that his enemies would rise. Fear that his own blood would betray him, not with daggers, but with claims. He began constructing a system to contain the chaos he sensed in his own lineage. A structure not built from trust or inheritance, but from exclusion and surveillance. Legitimacy became ritual. To be an heir, one had to be born of a queen, recognized by parliament, baptized before court, and survive the scrutiny of a father who saw ghosts in every crib. The children outside that circle were no longer seen as accidents. They were viewed as fissures in the divine architecture he had forged. Those within the palace learned quickly. To name a child not recognized was to invite scrutiny. To ask where they had gone was to be reassigned. To mention a resemblance was to risk disappearance. And so, a new kind of silence settled over court life. One that spoke not through hushes but through omissions. Some of these children had reached the age of awareness. They walked the gardens with tutors who never let them linger near the hedges. They spoke languages their siblings never heard. They were taught not to bow, not to kneel, not to interrupt, and above all, not to ask why. One boy, said to be 12, was rumored to write poetry in Latin and weep when the bells of Mass rang. Another, a girl with pale lashes and distant eyes, was confined to a house near the northern marshes. No visitors were allowed. The priest who tended to her vanished after the winter feast. Some were sent to monasteries, too young to read. Others were escorted through palace gates and never seen again. There were no deaths announced. Only movements, reassignments, transfers, and eventually, forgetfulness. Inside the Privy Council, new policies were drafted, documents that reaffirmed the rights of legitimate heirs, laws that, in their footnotes, nullified claims born of uncertified union. The ink used in those decrees ran thick. Some said the scribes were ordered to use red wax not for decoration, but to symbolize the bloodline being severed. Whispers of this structure reached the outer court. Foreign envoys asked carefully worded questions. Bishops hesitated before baptizing children with ambiguous lineage. The air inside the palace grew colder, not from winter, but from a tightening grip on what could be spoken. There was one account, buried in a diary later confiscated, of a night when a nurse was caught comforting a child by calling him "my little prince." The next day, the nurse was dismissed. The boy was never seen again. In that same winter, the royal painter was instructed to remove a background figure from a family portrait. The alteration was subtle. A shadow became a tapestry. An outline was painted into emptiness. Even art had to forget. Within the king's private chambers, discussions turned colder. Advisors no longer asked what should be done with the children. They asked only how quietly it could be arranged. The machinery of disappearance became refined. Midwives were instructed to deliver in isolated wings. Nurses were rotated without notice. No single servant ever saw the same child more than twice. Food was brought in covered. Names were never spoken aloud, and records were kept in ledgers that were later burned. The architecture of the palace itself conspired in the silence. Hallways twisted in ways that led to nowhere. Doors opened into empty chambers. There were rooms that no one cleaned, because no one was supposed to know they existed. Yet even in the stillness, the children left traces. Small fingerprints on frost-covered windows, a doll made of straw and red ribbon, found beneath a stairwell, a single book of Psalms, annotated in a trembling hand, with the final page torn out. Some of those close to the king began to wonder, not whether he had gone too far, but whether the throne itself had begun to consume him. One chaplain who served Mass for over a decade noted that the king no longer closed his eyes during prayer. He stared straight ahead, as if waiting for something to appear in the dark behind the altar. The queen at the time, his third, was known to ask often about the missing children. Her inquiries were met with silence, then dismissal, and eventually her own demise. Officially for betrayal, privately for remembering what should have been forgotten. By then, even the most devout understood. The palace was no longer a place of rule. It had become a place of ritual erasure, not just of people, but of connections. A place where love was dangerous, and memory itself was treason. There was no rebellion, no riot in the streets, no swords drawn in protest. There was only the quiet, chilling efficiency of a king who had decided that survival meant subtraction, that peace meant precision, that safety required sacrifice. And so, the children faded, not into legend, but into nothing. And those who survived, if any did, learned the most sacred rule of the Tudor court. To stay alive, you must not be seen. He was called Little Henry, not officially, not in any scroll or sermon, but among the lower servants, the ones who cleaned the steps before dawn and changed linens no one else touched. The name passed like breath. Little Henry. They said he had his father's eyes and the silence of a ghost. He used to appear during feasts, not at the table, but behind the drapes near the musicians, dressed in dark velvet, small hands folded, unmoving. The guards pretended not to see. The nobles looked away. Then one autumn, during the harvest banquet, he did not come. At first, no one noticed. The musicians played louder. The wine flowed quicker. But in the days that followed, a subtle panic began to spread. The maid assigned to his chamber was transferred to the coast. The tutor left without collecting his pay. And the guard who once brought him sweetmeats was sent to Calais for unspecified duties. His room was sealed, curtains taken down, bedding burned. Whispers followed the walls like mildew. Some said the boy had fallen ill. Others said he had tried to run. One old cook, half mad from wine, muttered to a scullery boy that he had seen a pale-faced child buried under moonlight, with no prayers and no stone. No one asked questions, not because they lacked curiosity, but because the palace had begun punishing memory. Shortly after, a new statute was read aloud in court. It redefined succession, not in loud declarations, but in footnotes, clauses, and revisions. Any offspring not born of a queen and not blessed by a bishop under the new church were henceforth deemed illegitimate, unfit, and without claim. The law was written in elegant script, tied with a gold ribbon, and stamped with a seal so heavy it cracked the wax beneath. Its true weight was not in its words, but in the silence that followed. One woman, once a nursemaid to a child whose name was never known, refused to sign her dismissal papers. She was found 2 days later, drowned in the well behind the herb garden. The official report listed her death as misadventure, but no one drank from that well again. In the northern wing of the palace, where the walls sweated with old secrets, a tapestry was taken down. Behind it, carved faintly into the stone, were letters: H, R, and the number 8. A boy's attempt at claiming identity, perhaps, or a cry no one was meant to hear. The court grew colder. Letters were intercepted. Guests were watched. Even members of the king's own bloodline spoke less, their sentences clipped, their glances hesitant. It was not only the bastards who were being erased. It was the idea that anything outside the king's control could be real. The very notion of a child born out of step with royal design became dangerous, and the throne began to breathe heavier. The isolation spread like rot beneath polished marble. What had begun as whispers now took form in rituals. Servants stopped greeting one another in certain corridors. Doors were knocked on twice, never 3 times. Windows were left slightly open in chambers no one slept in, as if to let souls out before the walls remembered them. There was a woman called Mistress Ellen, once tasked with tending to the lesser nursery. She walked with a limp and sang hymns meant only for infants. After little Henry disappeared, she spoke less, but her eyes grew sharper. One morning, she was accused of theft. The charge was baseless. She was dragged from the servants' wing and sent to Ireland without trial. The night before her removal, she left behind a bundle of cloth beneath the staircase. Inside was a child's wooden horse, worn smooth with use. One lord, distant in relation to the crown, dared to raise the question in private council. His concern was measured, his words careful. He did not ask about little Henry by name, only whether the law should be revisited, now that so many heirs had vanished or died. The king did not respond in anger. He responded with absence. The Lord was not invited again. And when he fell from his horse weeks later, the court called it misfortune. Even the Queen's correspondence was scrutinized. A letter she wrote to her sister, containing a single line about the boy with auburn curls, never reached its destination. The courier was found dead in a dry riverbed, his satchel torn open, its contents gone. Outside the palace, the people heard little. They celebrated births that were sanctioned, mourned deaths that were declared, and saw no reason to question the voids between. But within the stone chambers, among those who had once seen the shadow of a child pass behind a curtain, the silence became unbearable. Because silence was no longer protection. It was complicity. And the throne, now bathed in candles and prayers, demanded not loyalty, but obedience to its forgetting. It began quietly, as most tragedies do. The first was a girl, 7 years old, with dark hair and a fondness for violets. She lived in a manor east of the palace, where the river bent and the fog clung to the trees at dawn. One evening, she complained of chills. No physician was summoned. No prayers were said. The woman who tended her lit a candle beside the bed and left. When she returned at sunrise, the child was gone. The room had been emptied. The bedding burned in the orchard. There was no burial, no name, only a seamstress who whispered that she once measured a dress for a girl who never wore it. The next was a boy. He fell down a stone stairwell, they said. The steps were wet. He was alone. His body was never shown. Only the shoes remained, placed beside the gatehouse by unknown hands. Then came the child who was said to sing at night, the one who hummed tunes no one remembered teaching. One winter, the music stopped. A fire was lit in the west wing where he had slept. The flames burned quickly. When the ashes cooled, a single bell was found melted in the soot. There were those who claimed it was all coincidence. Illness, accidents, misfortune. But too many candles were extinguished without wind. Too many names vanished from the lips of those who had once spoken them with affection. One woman, who had once served as a wet nurse, was heard whispering in a chapel long after she had been dismissed. She spoke to no one, only to the altar. She said, "The children did not cry, not because they were brave, but because they had never been taught that anyone would come when they did. Their silence was not stoicism, it was resignation. A resignation learned in wombs that were watched, in nurseries that never received visitors, in lullabies that ended abruptly when footsteps approached. They were not buried with ceremony. They were not remembered in prayer. Some were given to the earth in the middle of the night, with hands trembling under cloaks, guided by moonlight and guilt. Others simply ceased to be. A steward once returned to the ledger room to find that 3 pages had been removed, not torn, cleanly cut. The ink of their names no longer existed, as though the act of birth had itself been undone. And so they disappeared, one by one, not with screams, but with absence. There was a woman called Agnes. She had once cared for one of the king's unacknowledged daughters, a quiet girl with a birthmark on her left cheek that resembled a small crescent moon. Agnes never revealed the child's name, but she remembered her laugh. It was soft, like water moving through a pipe that had not yet frozen. Years later, Agnes would live alone in a small cottage far from court. She refused to take visitors. But one evening, as her body gave way to age, a parish boy claimed to hear her speak in her sleep. She said, "They did not scream. They did not beg. They were born with the knowledge that they were temporary, that they were never meant to be loved in the open." The boy who fell ill was given no medicine. The girl who slipped near the fountain was said to have wandered. The child who refused to eat was called disobedient. Their endings were spoken in fragments, rewritten by those who needed to protect a throne more than a life. It was not hatred that killed them, it was protocol. And the throne, hungry and silent, was fed. For a time, the palace seemed calmer, the air lighter, the court more obedient. But among the tapestries and golden frames, a different story lingered, one of breaths never taken, futures never formed, and cradles that were never rocked more than once. Some claimed that on certain nights, just before the hour turned, the old servants could still hear footsteps in the west wing. Light ones, barefoot, as if a child had wandered out of hiding, searching for something that had never been promised. Not all ghosts wear chains, some wear silence. And those who had once held them, even briefly, knew this truth. The crown did not only demand loyalty, it demanded erasure, not of enemies, but of its own blood. The feast was prepared in silence. No musicians played. No dancers twirled beneath the chandeliers. The long table stretched beneath banners heavy with dust, untouched since the last heirs ceremony, now faded at the edges. The king sat alone. Before him, silver platters remained covered. The wine decanted hours ago had lost its aroma. The candles flickered, tall and unsure. He did not eat. He looked at the chair to his left. It had once been reserved for his son. Not the one written into the books, but the one no longer spoken of. The one whose name had never been recorded in the book of hours. The one who never turned 12. The fire behind him crackled with impatience. Shadows moved across the floor like forgotten prayers. The servants knew better than to enter. They waited outside the chamber, listening to the scrape of a goblet against the table, listening for any sound that would mean the feast had ended. But it had not begun. In a corner of the room, a tapestry hung crooked. It showed the king seated in majesty, surrounded by roses and saints. The artist had been ordered to remove 2 background figures before the final weaving. He had done so without protest. But the threads still bore tension in that space, like hands that had once reached toward the center, then vanished. The king raised his cup, then lowered it. He reached for a loaf, then stopped. His gaze wandered, not to the stained glass windows or the carvings of saints on the walls, but to the far end of the hall, where a single stool sat beneath a high arch. No one had placed it there. No one had dared move it. It was a child's seat. He watched it without blinking. A courtier once claimed that in those final winters, the king spoke less and listened more. But not to his ministers, not to his generals. He listened to the walls, to the wind through the grates, to footsteps that no longer belonged to the living. On the 3rd night of the fast, the king ordered the hearth to be lit higher. He did not shiver, but he watched the flames with a gaze that did not blink. One of the guards said he heard him whisper something to the fire. Not a prayer, not a name, just a word he could not understand. The next morning, the great chamber smelled of smoke, not of burning wood, of something older. A servant, young and newly assigned, was sent to clean the ashes before sunrise. He did not expect to find anything. But there, beneath the charred logs and half-melted wax, was a strip of cloth, white, or what once was white, stained in the center, edged with tiny lacework meant for a child's tunic. The servant did not touch it. He stepped back, turned, and reported to his superior. Within the hour, the hearth was sealed. No one asked how the cloth had arrived there. No one asked if it had been placed, or if it had crawled back. In the royal gallery, portraits lined the walls, queens painted in glory, princes with firm eyes and noble stances. But between 2 frames, where space should have allowed for one more, there was nothing, just stone. The king passed that spot every day, slower each time. He no longer turned to look. One of the old scribes, bent and nearly blind, once said that memory has its own architecture, that walls can hold names even after lips forget them. In the final month of the king's life, the halls echoed more than usual. The bells sounded longer. The wind crept beneath the doors. And those who still served him began to wonder, not if the forgotten children had died, but if they had ever truly left. The king was buried with splendor. A procession of nobles followed the casket. Choirs sang hymns laced with triumph. Bells rang through the cities as if mourning could be orchestrated into pageantry. The tomb was adorned with Latin inscriptions carved deep into black stone. Here lies the defender of faith, the father of a nation, the embodiment of majesty. But within the crypt, beneath layers of incense and velvet, there was no mention of the ones who had no names. No stone bore their memory. No chapel whispered their prayer. And yet, in the western wall of Windsor, past the old kitchens and beneath the disused servants' stair, there remains a corridor sealed in dust. The bricks are uneven, The mortar cracked, and near its base, just above the floor, there are marks no one speaks of. Scratches, letters carved by small hands, not deep, not wide, but unmistakable. A single name, unfinished, a date, partial, then symbols, circles, crosses, tiny impressions like fingernails dragged across damp stone. A scholar once tried to photograph them. His camera failed. The second attempt resulted in a film so overexposed it appeared blank. He never returned. Locals say that on certain nights, the wall grows cold to the touch. Not with winter's chill, but with a silence that does not come from absence, but from presence that was never allowed to be. In the royal archives, volumes line the shelves. Chronicles, sermons, letters. They speak of glory, of battles, of reformation and divine right. But there are gaps, years folded into single sentences, names that never reappear, events described with deliberate vagueness. And those who know what to look for see them clearly. The ghosts of lineage, the cost of a throne that feared its own reflection. One historian, writing long after the reign had ended, asked a question that has never been answered. He wrote, "If these children were erased, why does their absence echo louder than their presence ever could? Perhaps because they were never given voices. Perhaps because they were never supposed to become stories. But history, even when written in stone and scripture, cannot silence everything. There are still those who remember. An old woman who once folded blankets in a room without a window. A retired guard who refuses to walk near the western wall. A nun who wakes in the night, certain she hears a child reciting prayers in Latin, a voice she has not heard since her own childhood. They remember, and now, so do you. Because some legacies are not inherited. They are buried alive. And if history chose to forget them, then let the throne remember. Let the walls of palaces carry their weight. Let the silence speak where names were denied. If this story reached you, if you felt the breath of the forgotten touch your spine, then help bring them back from the dark. Like this story, share it. And subscribe to ensure that what was buried in silence will never be buried again.